Hello once again, Rays, and to many who are interested in KJ's reading of Money, Power, and Sex, the Lori Daybell Trial by Juror 18, Tom Evans. We're going to go right into it, all right? And as far as Lori's hearing today, we'll talk about this on the tail end of this book, okay? Along with the comments I've received so far on part 1 and part 2. There are a few people on here that have read the book. I appreciate your insights, and we'll just continue moving forward. So here we go. Chapter 8, What I Have Learned Since the Trial Ended, Answering Questions. After the trial was over, I walked away with more questions than answers. I knew at least some of the answers had to be out there. I would have loved to have just gotten back to what my life was prior to being called in for jury duty, but I had to get some answers. Life had changed for me, and my priorities were now different. Whether I wanted them to be or not, I was filled with overwhelming emotions, and I knew I had to deal with them in some way. I felt sympathy and a desire to help the families who were hurting in ways I could not even begin to comprehend, and a sense of wanting justice for Tylee, JJ, Tammy, and Charles. I decided pretty quickly that after getting caught up on my work, I would talk to whomever would talk to me and try to get as many of my questions answered as I could. That is really what prompted me to write this book. I felt like it would help motivate me and give me a purpose for asking the questions I desperately needed answered. I also felt a need to tell the story of the institutions and the people within them, peoples whose lives had been changed even more profoundly than mine and my fellow jurors. I wanted to tell the story of the court system and the people who work in it, detectives, investigators, and even the FBI specialists. To my great surprise, a lot of people were willing to talk to me, I guess because I had been a juror. I didn't know it at the time, but I had the exclusive privilege of talking to the police, the prosecution, and the judge. They weren't talking to the media because the Chad Daybell trial was coming up and they had to be careful. The defense refused to talk to me, and I respect that. They had nothing to gain by talking to me. After all, I'd been a juror, and the jury had convicted their client of all these charges. I would love to have asked why they didn't have any witnesses for the defense. I would love to have asked them if Lori Daybell was innocent, why she had lied to the police and the whole world saying her kids were okay. I would love to have asked them if she was insane, how did she know to lie? I would have loved to have asked them if Lori Daybell didn't kill her kids, who did? They really didn't have any answers that they could share with me, certainly none that would benefit their client or put her in a better light. One of the questions I'm left with is how this trial has affected the defense team. I sympathize with them. I do not think they are unaffected by it. In fact, I wonder if maybe they're more affected having had the thankless job of defending Lori Daybell. Are they struggling with their role? They were given the job of defending a person who, at the very least, allowed her kids to be murdered and then lied about it. They must have struggled with their obligations to defend her. Our system of justice requires them to give her the best defense they can muster. But if any case makes someone question that, it would be this one. Could they be struggling with it? I could imagine them asking themselves if they did the best they could to defend her. That was their mandate. They lived by the idea that everyone is due the best defense possible, but how can anyone defend her? Lori Daybell and her 2 defense attorneys were alone in that courtroom. As far as I could tell, no one else in that courtroom on any given day was on their side. They did, however, make sure she got due process, which is probably the best they could do. Our system of justice doesn't focus on outcomes. It only guarantees due process under the law. The only things that help me come to terms with any of this is knowing and believing in the institution of our court system and the right to a defense. In a less civilized setting, it would have been impossible to defend her, which means it would have been impossible to have had justice served. Revenge, maybe, but not justice. Everyone had a role, and each role was equally important. The prosecution, the defense, the judge, and the jury all have a responsibility to do their jobs to the best of their ability. And I would say especially for the defense. I say that because the defense is in the toughest position. They're the ones who have to try to defend the indefensible and do it to the best of their ability. I think it takes great character and a huge amount of belief in the justice system to do that job and do it well. Mr. Archibald did tell me his hands were tied because he couldn't bring up in court the fact that his client was insane, because that is all he would say. But if she was insane, how did she know to lie? I don't think insanity explains why she did what she did. It was calculated. It might explain how she could do it, though. She did it for money, power, and sex, but she had to be insane to be able to murder her children. So money, power, and sex were why she committed her crimes, and insanity was how she committed her crimes. We know Judge Boyce had to put the trial off for several months waiting for Lori Daybell to be declared fit for trial by the psychiatrist watching over her. I wondered what her mental state was like during this time. Was she off the rails nuts? Or was she just emotionally not fit for trial? I'm guessing she was just thoroughly shaken, and probably not because of what she had done, but because of the fact that she was being held to account for what she had done. Lowly humans who were so far beneath her had the gall to do that to her. I haven't been able to get a firm answer to that, so I'm just speculating by what I do know about her. This is why I would love to interview her. If ever given the opportunity, I feel like in a one-on-one conversation with her, I would be able to find out where we all stand in her eyes. Am I beneath her? Does she look down on me? Does she really feel like she's an exalted being? I understand my interviewing her would give her some kind of importance. I don't want to give her, and I can see why some people might think I shouldn't interview her for that reason. But I think it would be worth it just so I could write with more firsthand knowledge. I know she was put on some kind of medication. I guess it would have been something to calm her nerves. I also think Judge Boyce would have been extremely careful to make sure she was deemed fit for trial. Other questions I had after the trial ended. How could a mother kill her own children? What led her to the point where she was able to do it? How could Alex have been convinced to kill Charles, Tylee, and JJ and Tammy? How did Alex really die? How did Joe Ryan actually die? Is anyone looking into how Joe Ryan and Alex actually died, given what we know now? Did Melanie Gibb know the children, Tammy or Charles, had been murdered before the police caught on? Did Zulema know the children, Tammy and Charles, had been murdered before the police caught on? Could Zulema had murdered Alex? Was Melanie Boudreaux involved, or did she know about any of the murders or the attempted murder of her then-husband, Brandon? Was she following in Lori Vallow's footsteps, and was it her that called for the attempted murder of Brandon? What could possibly have made Lori Daybell think she was going to get away with it all? Were other people on Lori Daybell's list to be murdered, and if so, who? What would have happened if Larry and Kay had not gotten suspicious? Why couldn't Chad and Lori Daybell have found less harmful solutions? Any number of families in Rexburg would have taken the kids in and raised them as their own. Why weren't the police in Arizona more suspicious of Charles's death? Does Mormonism have any fault in what happened? Was Chad Daybell's prepper cult in any way tied to the fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? Or could it have been at least been influenced by the FLDS or any other offshoot of the mainstream Mormon church? Was he influenced by Mormon fundamentalism, at least? Was Chad Daybell a Jim Jones wannabe? How could anyone be in the light of how the People's Temple ended? I can understand why people distrust our government, but why do people live their lives on the premise that it is out to get them? I understand why people think they need to be prepared for some catastrophic occurrence, but why does that lead them to such extremes? Why do they think the world is about to end? And why do they think it's prophesized? Why do they read into the Bible and other teachings, some of which are extremely questionable, that the end of the world is going to happen on some particular day? The most profound question I had after listening to all the testimony in the court were, what was Tylee's life like? Was she manipulated by her mother? Why does she seem to have her mother's back in spite of the fact that she must have known her mother was lying? A lot of things I experienced sitting through this trial have haunted me, but none more than Tylee. Her response to her stepfather Charles's death was bizarre, to say the least. Tylee was interviewed twice by police on the day of the murder, once when she returned to Charles's house with Lori Vallow after dropping JJ at school, and again later that morning at the police station. In the video of her standing with her mother just across the street from the house where Charles lay dead, Tylee seemed happy and seemed to enjoy being questioned by the police. There was no indication that Tylee was upset or in any kind of shock at the death of her stepfather. Later at the police station, she described the events of the morning, still showing no emotion. Did Tylee feel safe? At what point might she have started to feel unsafe around her mother and uncle? I think I have come to some conclusions regarding Tylee, but the conclusions I have come to don't help to make me feel any better. It just makes me more angry at her mother. Nothing, I mean absolutely nothing, excuses or justifies Lori Daybell's actions toward her daughter. Lori Daybell's relationship with Tylee was filled with terror, manipulation, the most extreme betrayal, and finally murders. The murder of the most horrific kind imaginable. Murder at the hands of her mother. It fills me with rage toward Lori Daybell, and I don't think that rage will ever subside. Revenge is not my place. Justice is my role, and we served that. But I can understand why people who love Tylee would love to see Lori Daybell suffer. I can understand why they say anything horrible that happens to her in prison is not enough. I think seeing her in shackles during her sentencing must have felt somewhat good to some people, but I think her allocution statement probably took some of that away. Her allocution statement felt like a slap in the face to me, and I'm sure even more so to the family of the victims in that courtroom. I wondered if that was Lori Vallow Daybell's intention. I heard gasps, and I could see heads shaking in disbelief as she talked about the people she had murdered. She called Tammy my dear friend Tammy. She claimed her kids came to her and said, "You did nothing wrong here, Mom." She unbelievably claimed that no murders happened. Jesus Christ knows the truth of what happened here. Jesus Christ knows that no one was murdered in this case. I know I felt somewhat satisfied seeing her in shackles, shuffling into court, but that satisfaction was replaced once again by anger as I listened to her speak for the first time. The things she said were horrible, and she said them in such a manipulative way. Was her purpose to cause hurt and anger? I put nothing past her. Chapter 9, Why or How? People keep asking why Lori Vallow did what she did in some attempt to make sense of it, grasping to try to understand why a mother would brutally murder her own children. It's understandable. That's what we humans do. We have the gift of thought, and we can solve a problem. We can move forward in a better way without making the same mistakes. There are numerous TV shows, news articles, and blogs asking why, but the why is easy. In the words of the prosecution, it was money, power, and sex. Lori Daybell thought she was the beneficiary of her husband's $1 million life insurance policy, and she falsely collected Social Security from the death meant for JJ and from Joe Ryan's death meant for Tylee. That Social Security money funded her romance with Chad Daybell, and being with Chad Daybell gave her power over a lot of other people. The real question we need to answer, though, is how? How can a mother kill her kids? It's happened before, and it's definitely an anomaly, but maybe not as rare as you might think. According to Brown University's Alpert Medical School, filicide, the act of killing one's own child or children, happens on average 500 times per year in the United States alone. That's a bigger number than I would have ever expected. Melissa White Towns stabbed and strangled her 5-year-old daughter, Nicole, in Georgia in 2022. A police affidavit described how Towns stated she wanted to end her daughter's life because she was an evil child and did not want to deal with her anymore. After killing her, she drove her to a hospital emergency room wrapped in plastic. There are some similarities here, of course. JJ was wrapped in plastic, and Lori Daybell said he was possessed or evil. In 2018, Jennifer and Sarah Hart killed their 6 adopted children and themselves by driving off a cliff in Mendocino County, California. Police found evidence of premeditation. Here again, we see a couple who are both willing to kill their children. In 2001, Andrea Yates drowned her 5 children in a bathtub in Houston, Texas. In 2006, a jury found her not guilty by reason of insanity. In 1995, Susan Smith was found guilty of murdering her 2 kids, 3-year-old Michael Daniel Smith and 14-month-old Alexander Tyler Smith. She rode her car into the John D. Long Lake in South Carolina with her sons strapped in their car seats. In 1987, Mary Beth Tinning was convicted of killing her 4-month-old daughter in New York State. Several other of her children have died previously under suspicious circumstances. It happens, but how can a mother bring herself to kill her children? Andrea Yates was insane. Okay. Jennifer and Sarah Hart had large amounts of alcohol and Benadryl in their bloodstreams, which sort of explains that one, although a lot of people drink alcohol and take Benadryl and don't kill their children. Melissa White Town had previously been diagnosed with schizophrenia. Susan Smith went on to write romantic letters to her boyfriend from her prison cell, a boyfriend who did not want children. Mary Beth Tinning was released from prison in 2018 at the age of 80 after serving 30 years. I'm surprised she survived that long in prison. People say Lori Daybell will be hated by her fellow inmates for being a child killer. I have to wonder how long she'll last. Will she die at the hands of another mother in prison? Will she take her own life? Only time will tell. Lori Daybell seems pretty normal. I mean, if you had no idea what she did, and if you had never seen her picture before, you would not see anything abnormal about her. I think that's why it took a while for the police in Arizona to catch on. Not to mention, she's a master manipulator. Listening to her talk to people was really frustrating. She said "I" way too often, like everything revolves around her. And the inflection in her voice is so forceful and pushy. You must agree with her and do what she says. There's always an or else hidden in how she says things. So back to the question. And y'all, Opie's over here playing with the squeak toy. So if you hear it, this is life, y'all. So back to the question. How does a mother kill her children? What led Lori Vallow Daybell to do the things she did? Is she insane? Is she so narcissistic she could murder her own children for her own benefit? Was she actually speaking with angels who told her that her children were possessed and needed to be killed to save their souls? If we can answer these questions, maybe we can keep it from happening in the future. Maybe we would be able to recognize the danger signs or red flags and intercede. Unfortunately, these are the questions I don't have complete answers to, but they are definitely worth thinking about. We have to start with Lori Daybell's family and her childhood. I think it helps explain why she was so self-absorbed and narcissistic. In August of 2023, my wife and I took a road trip to Alaska to spend time with our daughter who lives up there. It's a 4,600-mile round trip, and we spent a lot of time in my pickup listening to Dr. John and Lauren Matthias. Dr. Matthias is great because he's able to explain psychological theory to a layman like me in a way that I can understand. Not that I agree with everything he says, but most of it makes sense. Dr. Matthias is a forensic psychologist and has spent a lot of time with murderers. He seems to be pure academic, but his insights are helpful. He goes to great lengths to explain to us how Chad and Lori Daybell could kill their children. According to Dr. Matthias, Lori Cox's father, Barry Cox, was apparently a true patriarch in the old-fashioned sense. The family was Mormon, and Barry was the priesthood holder. Barry seems to have been a very narcissistic person, feeling that he was above everyone else and putting his needs and wants above everyone else. So we listened to Lori Cox's cousin Megan on Hidden True Crime podcasts say that Barry might have been a sexual predator and he paid for Lori Cox's breast implants. Megan also says Lori Cox was a manipulator in any relationship. She could not be manipulated because she was always in charge. That is something important to know about her, especially when we consider her relationship with Chad Daybell. But why was she so manipulative? Did she learn to survive in a family with such a powerful father? Or did she learn it from him and follow his example? Barry seems to have especially felt that he was above the federal government. He failed to pay his taxes and was fined for it. He even wrote a book about it called How the American Public Can Dismantle the IRS and still owes hundreds of thousands of dollars in back taxes. This is important to us only because it gives us an indication of how powerfully he holds his beliefs. Fundamentalists believe the federal government is the enemy of the people and taxes are unconstitutional. Even though the Cox family was strictly Mormon, they seem to have not followed a lot of the rules or doctrines of the Mormon Church. Lori Cox's mother apparently dressed provocatively, which was a big no-no in the church, and would have caused a lot of judging from the rest of the congregations. The Cox family was also said to be more open about sex in general than what would have been considered normal, even to the point where it made people outside of the family uncomfortable. According to Lori Cox's cousin Megan, looks were extremely important in the Cox family. Putting on a good front and seeming to be better than anyone else was huge. She quoted Lori Cox saying, when they were young teenage girls, you had to dress a certain way if you wanted anyone to want to F you. We could take that as somewhat normal teenage banter, but because of what we know about Lori, I think we could say it to mean it was more important to her than what we would consider normal. Megan goes on to say she thinks the deaths of Lori's sisters Lolly, who died very young, and Stacy, who was an adult when she died, was very suspicious. When Stacy died, Alex was the only one home. The rest of the family was in Hawaii. Stacy had been suffering from extreme anorexia and diabetes. The family didn't even bother to come home when Alex called to tell them Stacy was on her deathbed. Anyway, the deeper I dig, the more strange information I come up with. Could there be more family secrets? There were a lot of deaths in Lori Daybell's life. Could murder have been part of life for Lori Cox growing up? Can we add Lolly's and Stacy's deaths to the list of suspicious deaths? So we see that the family Lori Cox grew up in was very different and led by what we can just go ahead and call a weird father. From what I have read and listened to, I think it's safe to say he was extremely domineering, kept his family separated from most normal people, and held himself and his wants above all else. The result of being raised in this way caused Lori to be narcissistic herself. I've learned that. If the parents are self-absorbed and uninterested in their children, it leads to the children having to think of themselves and put themselves first. They have to fight harder than what is normal to get what they need psychologically and otherwise. When this happens in early childhood development, it can lead to the child putting himself or herself above everyone else and everyone else's needs. So the chain of narcissism is repeated, handed down from generation to generation. What are the traits of a narcissist? Let's, for the sake of this discussion, ask what are the traits of an extreme narcissist. A total lack of empathy, extreme selfishness, a desire for power over others, being controlling, putting their personal success above everyone else, a tendency to blame others for their problems, an inability to recognize their own faults, and resorting to violence when other methods don't get the desired results. Obviously, Lori Daybell had no empathy for anyone. She was even willing to murder her own children to get what she wanted. That has to be the most selfish act imaginable. Teaming up with Chad Daybell helped her to gain power over others, but even pre-Chad Daybell, she seemed to have insisted on it. She was the manipulator. She was in control, and she was uncontrollable. She absolutely put her success above everything else, even to the point of putting herself in danger in order to get what she wanted. She married dangerous men to get away from her family. She destroyed her third husband just to get away from him, even though that meant giving up the security he provided. She must have known it was risky to murder her husband and her children and to steal their money, but she did it anyway. To this day, as I heard in her allocution statement at her sentencing, she blames others for her problems. She resorted to the most horrific type of violence to get what she wanted and seems totally incapable of taking responsibility for the position she's in. Nothing I have heard her say or have read about her gives the slightest indication she sees any fault in herself. Historically, there have been several infamous narcissists, and a lot have been written about them. People like Adolf Hitler, Ted Bundy, and O.J. Simpson have been studied intensely by psychiatrists in order to better understand narcissism. I think Lori Daybell will be added to that list. That explains Lori Daybell's narcissism, but doesn't completely explain how could she be in a frame of mind to kill her children. But now we know we have a complete and extreme narcissist, and knowing that, we can move on to other factors that led her to be who she was when she committed the murders and still seems to be today. Having the upbringing she had and being who she was open to the idea most people would not believe. She was open to the idea that she was an exalted human being. She was able to use her exalted status in her mind, feel she was above other people. She really believed, and I think she still believes, she is infinitely smarter than everyone else. This exalted status allowed her to believe she was a powerful being and had previous lives. In her mind, she was like Cleopatra reincarnated. Even before meeting Chad Daybell, she believed she had previous lives where she was a powerful woman. She believed she had the ability to see through the veil. The actual Mormon and Christian belief is that the veil separates us from God and protects us from having knowledge we aren't yet prepared to have. The veil is God's way of revealing himself to us only when we are spiritually prepared for it. Chad Daybell seemed to believe that when you were born, a veil is placed over you to keep you from remembering what you knew before you came again to the world. It's similar to reincarnation, but not exactly the same. The belief is we all have past lives, or what he calls probations, and people were always human in their prior lives. The more lives one has had, the more experience one would have. In Chad and Lori Daybell's case, this led to them believing they were exalted humans in the past lives. I can't explain why the idea that people have had previous lives led them to believe that their own previous lives were better than everyone else's previous lives, but we can see that they made that assumption. They don't believe they had been garbage collectors or housemaids. They believed they were walking with Jesus. I guess that's what where narcissism comes in. Okay, so exalted human beings with the ability to see through the veil. They believed they had past lives, and those lives were spent with Jesus and the angels. This meant that they had so much knowledge than anyone else, that that's why they weren't capable of understanding their actions. We simply don't know. Only they are capable of knowing. Dr. Matthias thinks that is what Lori Daybell is saying in her phone conversation from jail with her son Kobe. She says, "You weren't there. You don't understand." It is believed that what she means by this is that Kobe is incapable of understanding because she has so much more knowledge than Kobe. We get more insight on Chad Daybell from Heather Daybell, who was interviewed by Lauren Matthias and Dr. John Matthias. Heather is Chad Daybell's brother, Matt's wife. Heather and Matt moved to Rexburg before Chad Daybell and his family. She says she was unhappy when Chad Daybell moved his family to Rexburg because she was afraid he would make her look bad in church. Chad Daybell and Heather never liked each other because, according to Heather, she saw through him and knew what he was capable of. She even warned the church authorities about Chad Daybell. Heather had been raised in a more matriarchal family where women were treated equally. She refers to Chad Daybell's father as always blaming the daughter-in-law for the problems of the sons. She says while the kids were missing before they were found in Chad Daybell's backyard, she talked to the bishop of her and Chad Daybell's ward, telling him she suspected Chad Daybell. The bishop told her he was hoping for the best and seeing the best in Chad Daybell. She felt that because of the priesthood and the fact that only men held it, her opinion didn't matter much as Chad Daybell's, even though she held a high position in the church. She was the Relief Society president. The Relief Society is a woman's organization in the Mormon Church. All women are members, and it is the way for women to improve themselves spiritually. She says that a man's opinion holds more weight than a woman's more weight than a woman's was true her whole life. When they were children, the girls were always blamed for the actions of the boys, and as adults, the wives were always blamed for the actions of the husbands. Whatever the reason, Chad Daybell was not excommunicated from the church until after the bodies were found. Here we need to go back to Dr. John Matthias and his explanation for Chad Daybell. According to Dr. Matthias, it was all about mortality and controlling death for Chad Daybell. Chad Daybell was obsessed with death, and his own mortality scared him, so he had to believe he was above it all. This is very important because it is what drove him. The priesthood and the teachings of the church put him above everyone else. The priesthood, by the way, is the Mormon Church's way of saying that all men are above women. All men have rights to the priesthood and no women do. So men are the bosses and the women are subservient. It's not to mean that the Mormon Church intentionally demeans women. Women are very much valued and to be respected, but it does mean that their main role is to support the men. In Chad Daybell's mind, he had to control death. His exalted status, his deciding who lived or died, put him in charge of mortality. I know it's not how the rest of us think, but because of his past, it worked for him. What about Chad Daybell's past? What was his childhood like? According to Heather, Chad Daybell's mother, Sheila, was only there to do the work and make babies. There was absolutely no respect for her, and Chad Daybell and his siblings were taught to treat her like a slave. Because of this, the children, or Chad Daybell at least, had no attachment to her. How could one be attached to such a lowly human being? Because of this upbringing, Chad Daybell has no respect for women. Yet we hear him call Lori Vallow Daybell his exalted goddess. Was she exalted in his eyes, or was he manipulating her? Of course he was manipulating her. He was using his position above her to get sex from her. She was way above him in the looks department, but she looked up to him because of the attention he was getting from the books he had written and because of his standing among his followers. Why was she attracted to him? He was an overweight, middle-aged man. She used her looks and sex to manipulate him as well. She believed he was an exalted being, and she wanted to be with him so she could have a higher spiritual standing as well as a higher human standing. And cult leaders always seem to have a power-seeking woman. We're getting closer to answering the question of how they could kill their children, but there still has to be more to it. A lot of people like to say they were evil, but it's way too easy to just say they were evil. In fact, that lets everyone off the hook. If we just say, well, they were evil, that takes all responsibility off people like Lori Daybell's father, Barry, or anyone else involved in their lives. It takes the responsibility off the church and their bishop. Not that any of those are in any way responsible for what happened, but that maybe our attitudes influence events or other people's actions. We all have to be willing to take responsibility for our part if we're going to understand. Another way to look at how Lori and Chad Daybell could kill the children is this. The power to take away the life of another person makes the killer more than human. Having the power over another human being's mortality makes a killer feel they are immortal. In chapter 3, I mentioned the book Visions of Glory. It was sitting by Lori Daybell next to the pool in Kauai when she was served with the papers to produce J.J. and Tylee. That book was written by John Pontius in 2017 and is astonishingly still available in the LDS bookstore. It has sold over 100,000 copies and is extremely popular among the prepper or end-of-days community, even though it contradicts Mormon scripture. It describes the 10 tribes and the building of New Jerusalem, previous lives or probations, people being married to people other than who they are married to now, near-death experiences, the apocalypse, and all of the things that led up to what Chad and Lori Daybell became. Some people who read it take it as scripture, meaning that it is the Word of God, even though the author claims it's fiction. Whatever it is or however you take it, it is extremely controversial, and a lot of people, not just Chad and Lori, have used it to guide their lives and not always in good ways. I think there will be a lot more to say about it when more truths come to light through the Chad Daybell trial and from what people are currently uncovering. I know none of these explanations by themselves explain how Chad and Lori Daybell could do what they did, but I think that when we put it all together, it makes sense in a very perverted way. We'll go on to the next part. I'm going to let y'all sink that in. Leave your comments. The next few chapters are going to be whoppers, y'all, so be looking for those. I love you all, and keep on looking.